Hello, this is the last of the original videos I currently have planned covering Sunnova's second set of books, but there's definitely a possibility that I will make more videos, depending on what comes out in Sunnova's bankruptcy. So let's just cut right to the chase. I'm going to scroll down here, copy these labels over. What you're looking at now is the secret version of Sunnova's megawatt data. This is the version investors were not supposed to see. And I'm going to highlight the numbers right here in rows 637 and 641. Now, I have a very direct question here. The numbers in these two rows, rows 637 and 641, yeah, were those numbers fabricated? Not were they misreported or miscalculated, but were these numbers outright fabricated? Did someone just make these numbers up? Now, that is one hell of a strong question to ask, but there are good reasons to ask it. The first reason is that the rest of Sunnova's second set of books indicates that just in theory, it would be virtually impossible for Sunnova to accurately record any data in those two rows. The second problem is that the rest of the second set of books also indicates that the data that actually is entered into these two rows is literally impossible. And the third big problem is that someone built a backdoor into Sunnova's financial statements that disabled Sunnova's own internal checks for the megawatt data and only the megawatt data. This would make it very easy to fabricate the megawatt data without being detected, and as far as I could tell, that's really the only thing it can do. So again, just to be clear, I'm not saying the data in rows 637 and 641 was fabricated. I'm just saying that given these extraordinary irregularities, it seems like a fair question to ask. Now, as I've laid out in the previous videos in this series, the hidden data clearly indicates that Sunnova is taking batteries which are privately labeled lease and loan storage and misreporting them as additional solar customers. And if you assume my analysis there is correct and then you think about it for a second, then it should become pretty obvious to you that this makes it virtually impossible for Sunnova to accurately report its megawatt data. The reason why is that if Sunnova inflates their reported solar customers, then their reported solar customers are going to look suspiciously small unless the megawatts figures are also inflated. So if you already know that a residential solar company is inflating their solar customer counts, but the average size of those systems come out looking right when you cross-reference it with the megawatt data, which is true in Sunnova's case, then that would very strongly imply that the megawatt data has been inflated. However, that kind of undersells the lead here, because if a residential solar company was going to inflate its megawatt data, there wouldn't really be a good way to do it. Okay, so let's back up a second. If a company was going to inflate any numbers, they would ultimately only have two ways to do it. They could play games with existing numbers and use creative definitions and interpretations to mislead investors, or they could just make up numbers that sound right, just outright fabricate the numbers. Or you could do some combination of the two. Now, while Sunnova has a clear track record of playing games with the numbers, I think that's pretty clear from my prior analysis of the second set of books, that option would not work for the megawatt numbers because there's no numbers with which they could play games with. More importantly, however, the reason there are no numbers you can play games with here is also why the megawatt data would, in my opinion, inevitably turn into this logical knot that would be impossible to solve without just making stuff up. So, if you were passing off batteries as solar systems, the logical thing to do to make your megawatt numbers look right would be to take the storage capacity of a battery and misreport it as the generative capacity of a solar system. In other words, if you were looking at how to play games with the numbers, the only real move here would be to mix battery megawatt hours in with solar megawatts, and then just call the whole thing megawatts deployed. However, that would not work in practice, because the storage capacity of Sunnova's typical battery is about double the generative capacity of Sunnova's typical solar system. So if Sunnova tried mixing those numbers together, they would wind up having the exact opposite problem. Their reported solar systems would come out looking suspiciously large. The numbers would just look like a different kind of wrong. And even if Sunnova was able to make the average overall customer size look right, they would just wind up with yet another problem. All of these shenanigans with the misreported batteries only affect the lease and loan customers, not the PPA customers, because PPA batteries effectively don't exist. So even if they solved the overall average customer size problem, they would still wind up with an implausibly large size difference between their PPA customers and their lease/loan customers. They would just have layered problems. So my conclusion based on this information is that it would not even be theoretically possible for Sunnova to be reporting megawatt data that is not at least partially fabricated. Personally, I just don't see any other way these numbers could work here, given the reporting errors with the solar customer counts. So this wouldn't be an issue of someone playing games with the numbers. This would be an issue where someone was just making the numbers up. That is my own personal opinion based on my own analysis of these numbers. And you know, it's funny, I have Sunnova's second set of books, right? So let's go digging around in the megawatt data, you know, the secret version of the megawatt data that Sunnova is hiding from investors, and see if there's any evidence that the numbers have been tampered with. Well, first things first, as you can see here, Sunnova does have data associated with lease storage and loan storage. They're right here in rows 637 and 641. And like all videos in this series, this is still based on the third quarter 2024 version of this file. And lease storage and loan storage customers are battery-only customers according to the rest of the hidden data. So if that's true, then these would have to be battery storage megawatts, and Sunnova would, at the very least, be juicing its reported megawatt deployed figures with the megawatt hours of batteries, because the plugs show that these lease and loan storage megawatts are being moved into the normal lease and loan categories, and then the inflated number that has a mix of both types of megawatts is what is being reported to investors as the lease and loan megawatts. That would already be pretty bad, but let's do a little more analysis and check if these batteries are actually battery sized. So I contacted Sunnova in May of 2024, and they told me that the smallest battery they sold at the time I called them was 10 kilowatts, but that was a specialist system that very few people could actually install. The smallest battery that Sunnova regularly sold was 13.5 kilowatts, and that also happened to be their standard sized battery. So for most customers, if they wanted a battery, that battery was going to be 13.5 kilowatt hours. And for the record, I contacted Sunnova 3 different times to confirm this information was correct, and they told me the same thing each time. Alright, so I pulled a bunch of customer and megawatt data into a separate spreadsheet, and now we can start to figure out the average size of Sunnova's batteries. And because I made this video last, I went ahead and included the fourth quarter 2024 data, as you can see here, even though the rest of this video and the rest of this video series are both based on the third quarter 2024 report. The stuff marked in green is copied verbatim from the hidden data. That is straight from Sunnova's second set of books. The stuff marked in blue is what I calculated off of the hidden data. Now, net megawatts deployed is marked in blue, which might seem strange, but I'll come back to that in a few minutes and you'll see why I did it that way. So down here is the average size of Sunnova's customers, and this is measured in kilowatts. 1 megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts. Highlighted in yellow are what the hidden data says are battery customers, and that's their average sizes. Now, there's two ways to look at this. You can use the cumulative numbers, which is the total number of customers and megawatts Sunnova had in that particular quarter, including stuff from earlier quarters, or you can use the net numbers, which are all the customers and megawatts Sunnova added in just that one quarter. It's just the new stuff. However, it doesn't actually matter which version you decide to use or look at, because under both versions of the numbers, the average size of both the lease and loan storage customers is way smaller than the smallest battery Sunnova actually sells. And it's usually around half the size of the standard battery Sunnova sells. So if the rest of the hidden data is correct about these being battery-only customers, then the megawatt data for the lease and loan storage customers is literally impossible. Now, Sunnova is trying to publicly claim that I have it wrong, that these are actually customers with solar systems and batteries. There are a lot of problems with that claim that I have covered earlier in this series, but you know, these are plausible sizes for solar systems. And this is the first and so far only place in the hidden data I've been able to find where, at face value, the numbers both agree with Sunnova and disagree with my analysis of the rest of the hidden data. So I would be foolish if I did not carefully examine and analyze something that contradicts my analysis. Confirmation bias is absolutely a thing. The problem, though, is that if you look at this data more closely, it doesn't quite seem to be internally consistent. To start, as you can plainly see, the normal lease and loan customers basically always have a larger average size than the lease and loan storage customers. So what that means is, if what Sunnova is saying was true, then their customers who have batteries would need to be consistently buying solar systems that are significantly smaller than the customers who don't have batteries, and that just doesn't make sense. And if you look at the net numbers, that's the version on the bottom, it would also mean that from the first quarter of 2023 to the first quarter of 2024, Sunnova's new lease customers who do not have batteries would have doubled the average sizes of the solar systems they were leasing from 5.3 kilowatts to 10.6 kilowatts, while the solar systems leased by new customers who did have batteries stayed almost the exact same size. That also does not make a lick of sense. And this is not an isolated case. I mean, just look around. If you break this down on a net basis, a lot of the numbers jump around in ways that just don't make sense. I mean, these are all plausible sizes for solar systems, yes, but it's not plausible that the average size of Sunnova's new customers in each of these categories could jump around so much. And these are the numbers that the Excel formula shows feed directly into the numbers that are reported to investors. So if these numbers are wrong, then Sunnova's reported numbers are wrong. This does come out looking neat when it all gets merged together and reported to investors as a cumulative number, but the source data that investors don't see does not look neat. It does not look right. It jumps around in implausible ways. Now, I'm sure that Sunnova will try the standard line that all companies use in situations like this, which is to say, "How dare you question our numbers? We maintain high standards of integrity and transparency in our financial and regulatory disclosures, and we have a robust and rigorous process in place for checking our numbers." Although, I suppose Sunnova won't be saying that because they just went bankrupt, but that is what they almost certainly would have said if they were a going concern. Yeah, so the problem with Sunnova trying to say that here is that Sunnova disabled its internal checks for the megawatt numbers, and I can't trust your checks if you turn them off. So let me show you how Sunnova did that. So if you go down here to the bottom left, you see that Sunnova runs all of these boring checks. And what these are doing is they're taking numbers that are logically related but calculated independently, and then cross-referencing to make sure that you didn't make a typo or a mistake or something like that. So if you add up last quarter's cumulative customer numbers and this quarter's net customer numbers, you should get this quarter's cumulative customer numbers. And if you don't, then you know you made a mistake somehow. It's checking for stuff like that. Not necessarily literally that exact check, but like that is the sort of thing they would check for here. This is how you avoid making typos in your financial statement. If you make a typo, these checks will catch it automatically. Now, this last line over here is for the fourth quarter of 2024, and the data for that doesn't really exist yet, so these checks are getting tripped by dummy data. I'm gonna go ahead and delete them so it's not distracting for the next part. Now, if I go up to, say, the cumulative customer numbers, and I go over here and I type in something outrageous like, I don't know, like 5 trillion. And then I go back down here to the checks. We can see that it trips a check. Like the data gets angry at you if you do that. Like it catches the mistake. So now let's say I go down to the megawatts deployed data. And I don't know, I type in something outrageous like, oh, I don't know, that. It's not even a number. It's got a bunch of dashes in it. It's like a world's longest phone number. Nothing. It trips no checks. Here, I'll go back. I'll type in a real number. No checks. Why doesn't it trip any checks? And the answer is because the net megawatts deployed section simply isn't here. So there's nothing to compare it to. They just run all of the megawatt data off of this one single source. Everything megawatt related that investor sees ultimately comes out of these numbers and only these numbers, nowhere else. This is the single source. And that has the effect of making it impossible to cross-reference these numbers, because they are all routed through a single source. And cross-referencing is how Sunnova checks numbers, at least according to the checks visible to me in this spreadsheet. I'm going to insert a quick side note here because this is where a lot of people got a bit lost when I showed them a draft of this video. So there are two distinct problems here. The first problem is that there are no checks on the megawatt data. Like, there's a bunch of checks down here at the bottom of the spreadsheet, and there's no line item for the megawatt data. The check just doesn't exist. The second problem is that because the net megawatts deployed data up here is blank, it is not possible to add functional checks. So when I say the checks were disabled, I'm describing a situation where checks that obviously should exist, as I'll explain in a second, do not exist, and it is impossible to add them. And with that side note over, let's get back to what I was saying. There are some numbers in this spreadsheet that cannot be cross-referenced because there is nothing to cross-reference them with, but this is the only place that I could find where Sunnova could have cross-referenced the numbers with something else, but chose not to. There's literally a space for the net megawatt numbers, and someone obviously made a choice not to use it. Just to be clear what I mean by that, it is such an obvious departure from how Sunnova normally does its numbers that it is essentially impossible, in my opinion, for this to have been anything other than an intentional choice. And that was an irresponsible choice because it removes all redundancy from these numbers. Based on what I can see in this spreadsheet, if someone made a typo or fat-fingered something in the megawatt deployed data, the only way to catch that would be to hope that someone spotted it manually. And for some reason, Sunnova chose to take that risk here with these numbers when it could have so easily been avoided. Again, they have a space for it built into the spreadsheet, they're just choosing not to use it. So, why does this matter? Well, it's incredibly suspicious when you realize the context. That's why it matters. You see, these checks have very interesting implications if you suspect that Sunnova is lying to investors, because these checks could either work for or against Sunnova depending on how they were lying. Do you remember how earlier in this video I said that if any company wanted to mislead investors by publishing incorrect numbers, they could either play games with the numbers or just fabricate the numbers, just make them up? Yeah, these checks will help you if you're playing games, but work against you if you're fabricating the numbers. For example, if you are switching numbers around and doing things like calling apples oranges, then these checks would actually help you keep your lies straight, because they are really good at making sure you don't accidentally tell the truth. It will remind you if you forgot to add your fake oranges to your real oranges whenever you're telling investors how many oranges you have, and that means you can keep the lies consistent. However, these checks make it really difficult to just type in made-up numbers, because you would have to go through and manually change each logically related source in a way that means the numbers will come out looking consistent, and it's really easy to get tripped up doing that. So let me use the megawatt data in a hypothetical example just to show how this could be a problem. The megawatt data looks rounded off in the spreadsheet because of how it's formatted, but it's actually calculated out to a few decimal places. So if you were going to fabricate the net and cumulative megawatt data separately, you would have to make them add up perfectly each and every time to avoid tripping one of these checks, and at a minimum that's going to be annoying. But it's also going to be very, very easy to screw up, and you'd only have to screw up once to get caught if you were unlucky. And that same basic problem would apply to basically any other number in the spreadsheet if it was being fabricated. So why would you go through all that trouble when you can just disable the checks and calculate everything off of one single source? That's obviously how you would circumvent this. Not only would this make your life far easier, but it's not going to look suspicious to investors if investors never see it. Remember, Sunnova was obviously trying to hide this from investors. Also, there's no point in running checks on numbers that you made up. Like, you don't need something to tell you the numbers are wrong. You already know the numbers are wrong, that's the point. So these checks would serve no practical purpose to you. So if the megawatt data is being fabricated, Sunnova would suddenly have very good reasons to disable the checks and no reasons to keep them. So that would explain these extraordinary irregularities. That, of course, doesn't mean this is the only explanation, but it is the only explanation I can think of. There could be more I didn't think of, who knows. But to be fair here, it's not like there's ever a legitimate reason for a public company to disable its own internal security and quality controls on numbers it reports. But Sunnova did just that anyways. I mean, this is an inherently suspicious way to do your second set of books. Now, as I explained in, well, basically the rest of this video series, Sunnova tends to grossly misreport numbers by switching them around. Now, if you assume this was an intentional act, perhaps because it happens so often, or because it's shockingly predictable, as I explained in the last video, or because there are literally written instructions to do it at least once in cell EN567, then these checks would help Sunnova keep its lies straight virtually everywhere except the megawatt data. You wouldn't be able to switch the megawatt data around because there's nothing to switch it with. So that data would essentially have to be fabricated. And that means that's the one place where the checks would work against Sunnova if they were lying about this, and that also happens to be the one place where the checks are disabled. So if the megawatt data in rows 637 and 641 of the third quarter 2024 supplemental workbook was fabricated, then that would fit perfectly with every other irregularity I found in Sunnova's second set of books. It would also explain why the data in those rows appears to be literally impossible, but miraculously comes out looking right to investors. It would also explain why Sunnova would disable its own internal checks on the megawatt data and only the megawatt data, which would remove all redundancy from that data when there appears to be no legitimate reason to do so. So again, and I just want to be very clear about this, I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm not saying that Sunnova's megawatt data is partially fabricated. I'm just saying that I find this string of irregularities to be very strange, and I would really appreciate it if Sunnova could provide a plausible explanation for this.